Okay, this is a quick and dirty discussion of the progressive era. Just kind of an overview of material that will be useful to help you comprehend and incorporate this material. We're going to talk in the front end of the course. So in United States history, there has been a pattern where you have periods of reform and periods of reaction to reform or more conservative times. So they're sort of, they're often spoken about as a pendulum that swings one way or the other. And so there have been in United States history periods of reform that deal with, sometimes it's primarily economic reform or political reform. Sometimes it's a broader cultural reform. One of those periods is known as the progressive era. And the progressive era is a period that starts right around the turn of the 20th century. The progressive era is a remarkable period of reform because it encompasses so many different aspects of action in the United States. Cultural, economic, political, social, a whole number of different things are going on. And to understand the progressive reform, you have to know that there were previous eras of reform that were more or less successful. And these new eras of reform build upon these previous successes and failures. And so our reaction and a continuation of previous events. The progressive era, it's historians both like to talk about the progressive era because it fits in very well with how one would structure a lecture and discussion, because it has really kind of a nice, tightly bounded period of time. There really is nobody who would consider themselves a progressive of a type until 1900. The progressive era took over American society in a variety of different ways, and I'll talk briefly about what being a progressive means. To the point that in the 1912 election, so in 1900, there's nobody politically who calls themselves a progressive. It was a term that did not exist. By 1912, you had 4 candidates running for the presidency, and all 4 of them tried to grasp the mantle of progressive reform, right? They all said that they were progressives who were more reform-minded than their competitors, right? So you have 4 candidates running for the presidency in 1912 who are running as some version of a progressive. And it reaches its highest point, as we shall see in the Kennedy book, where the progressives are shaping and influencing the way the nation is both preparing and conducting involvement in World War I. It reaches its apex with the greatest impact it had in American life, social, cultural, militarily, economically, in all sorts of fashions. It reaches its apex during the war and then almost completely disappears. The 1920 election is an election that is rejecting these progressive ideas. In fact, the candidate who won resoundingly, Warren G. Harding, ran on a slogan of what he called return to normalcy, which is an explicit rejection of everything the progressives were involved in. So to understand a progressive, you have to understand they're in reaction, they're seeking to reform American life as a result of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is a period not unlike, in some aspects, the current economic dislocation that we are involved in terms of a small number of people who are acquiring and have a stranglehold on the largest share of wealth and a vast percentage of the population who are struggling in one fashion or another. So you have this enormous gulf between a very small number of people who are wealthy and and acquiring more wealth, and a great mass of laboring poor, which in the latter 19th century is fueled by immigration of a number of desperate people from Europe and other places who are flooding into this nation, where they are both filling low skilled labor that is generating this great wealth, and challenging and shaping and reshaping the basic fabric of this nation. So you have the flood of people who speak different languages, different ethnicity, different religions, and they're changing this nation at the same time that they're vital to the nation's expansion, because these wealthy owners of the Gilded Age are creating their fortunes literally on the backs of these poorly paid and poorly treated immigrants. So this nation, the Gilded Age, the term Gilded Age is actually coined by Mark Twain, and I can't remember who the co-author is. And gilding something is when you take what is a base metal and you cover it with an expensive metal. So you gild something with gold. So you would take a lead, let's say it's a doorknob. So you have a lead doorknob, which is heavy, but lead's cheap metal, but then you cover it in gold leaf and it looks really expensive, right? So the gold looks expensive. So you think it's a solid gold door handle, but it's not. It's gilded, right? It's basically a cheap system that has a lot of a thin veneer of wealth on top. Mark Twain was talking about American economic society, in which you have the vast number of people who are who are in desperate straits, and only a thin strata of super wealthy. So when you look at the Gilded Age, it looks like things are going great, but the benefits of this economic renaissance, industrialization, are accruing in only a small number of hands, right? The 1900 election was a watershed election that shifted and served as the death knell of a rural-based reform movement known as the Populists. But the challenges that American life and society and economy and politics had at that time still called out for reform. And so there was a resurgence of a new reform movement that was different than the previous reform movement of the Populists. Populists were primarily a rural-based movement. Kansas was radical in the 19th century, extremely radical, because the Populists called for an abandonment of, or a great change in the way that capitalism operated in this nation. And they were firmly rejected in the 1900 election, 1896 election, and then 1900 election, which installed a worldview in political terms that was conservative, pro-business, and urban. The person at the head of that movement in the Republican Party was a man by the name of McKinley, who was assassinated after his re-election in 1900. And the presidency fell to his vice president, a man by the name of Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt was going to serve as a catalyst for some radical changes in American life that become part of the progressive movement. Although Teddy didn't create the progressive movement, but Teddy, in many ways, because of who Teddy was, he helped to facilitate this expansion. So the progressive movement, if you had to pin down, right? And so I guess pin is a good way to think about it, because it has been said about the progressives that trying to identify the progressives is like trying to nail jelly to the wall, right? The progressives are this multitude of different people pursuing a multitude of different goals that all center around the notion of reform. So you have people who are wanting to reform economic life. You have people who want to reform, they want to prevent people from drinking. So you have a group of people called the Dries who are part of this. You have people who say, women are acting untoward, so women's behavior needs to change. But then you also have progressives who are women who are saying women need to have a political role and a public role. So there's a lot of different tensions going on. They all circle around this notion of change, and the primary drivers of this progressive movement are different than the populist movement. The populist was a rural-based movement. The progressive movement was an urban-based movement, an urban reform movement, and it was driven, the leadership was primarily driven by a set of people who are middle class and lower upper class. They consider themselves old stock Americans, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who come from relatively well-off terms, and they see the nation changing, both because of the small strata of super wealthy known as the plutocrats, who are rigging the system in industrial change to benefit themselves. And then you have a huge mass of the laboring poor, many of which are ethnic immigrants from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, right? So you have this tension between the two, and then you have a set of people who see this nation, who are beginning, as they see it, to come apart over these issues of economic inequality. And so the progressives are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, generally, who come from relative economic circumstances. They're not super wealthy, the plutocrats, but they are relatively well off. They tend to be younger and college educated. And some aspects of the progressive movement, there's a lot of women who are involved in the leadership, right? So this progressive movement, it's a reform movement that it begins to develop, a portion of the progressive movement begins to develop in economic and political reform ideas, right? There are also social aspects of it. So as I said, there's discussion about whether or not drink is evil, right? So this idea of people reforming to adhere to what they consider good American behavior is the conceptualization of these progressives and the way they see an ideal America, right? An ideal America in which everyone has an opportunity. These progressives, they don't favor the activities of the super wealthy and the mistreatment of the laboring class, but they also don't favor radical action like unions, right? The progressives hold out this ideal that the founding fathers created a system where we can all benefit, and they call for equality, but they also fear the disturbances that are in place because of the abuses of ethnic minorities, particularly the Black and Native American populations. And so they encourage the minority populations to accept the lower class status of Jim Crow, even though it violates the ideals of what they say the founding fathers hold out, because the violence of this population that is oppressing the minority populations is tearing the nation apart. And so they're fearful of that. And so they encourage segregation as a temporary measure. The long-term goal is we need to fix this, but in the short term, accept this segregated status because they fear the conflict that is unfolding about this. The economic reforms come to be recognized by the progressives. The economic issues lay at the heart of many of the problems, as the progressives see it, that American society was grappling with. And so they encourage political reforms in which wider spread governmental action is required. The progressives fear radical action, and they consider unions and that sort of group organizing as dangerous to the ideals of American life. And they view it as something that is radical and alien from Europe rather than the system that the founding fathers set up. That's how they interpret it, right? So they're opposed to unions, but they recognize that big business is running roughshod over workers. And so they seek another way of addressing these problems as opposed to radical activity like unions and socialism, right? What they encourage is that there's government regulation. And so regulation becomes a key hallmark of this process of reform, particularly economic and political reform, because the progressives see that you need somebody to protect the public, because unrestrained capitalism seeks to maximize its profits at whatever the cost it is to the general public and the working class. So progressives see that the only entity that's powerful enough to hold and keep in check these large businesses is government action. So the progressives favor government regulation. One of the hallmarks of progressive ideas in this venue of government regulation is that there's a way that this could be done fairly and dispassionately by a group of experts. Progressives favor this idea that a dispassionate group of experts can manage things more fairly than unrestrained capitalism, and certainly more fairly than a grouping of workers in radical action like a union or socialism, right? And so they encourage this sort of expertise as something that they, as a class, as a group, progressives have in abundance. And how do we know they're experts? Well, they have credentials, right? So this management by experts is called scientific management. I'll give you a classic example. Forests are a natural resource. You can use forests and chop them down to make lumber to build stuff, right? They also have a benefit in and of themselves. So this idea of a forest is something that can have other functions as opposed to just pure commodity functions, is something that the progressives embrace as well. So the forest is the place that rejuvenates the spirit, right? But the forests are all being cut down, and they're being cut down by industrial production, right? The cutting down of forests on a massive scale is accelerating through the 19th and into the 20th century. And what was initially seen from the earliest days of this nation and before we were a nation, when we were colonies, was that this was a place of inexhaustible resources. Well, the clear cutting of forests, which was accelerating, proves that it's not inexhaustible. It can be exhausted, and was being exhausted, and would continue to be exhausted unless there was something that stepped in to protect it. That something to step in to protect it is government regulation. In the form of this natural resource of forests and other natural elements, is called conservation. And conservation is a perfect embodiment of this strand of progressive reform. Conservation can be termed wise use, right? Not that it shouldn't be used. That's something different, right? But that the use of it could be managed so that all could benefit from it. The companies could continue to extract lumber and make profits on it. That's capitalism, right? But the forest would be regulated and protected so that people could go hike and camp in the forest as well. They would still be there. Left to their own devices, the accelerating industrial consumption of this resource would lead to clear cutting the forest, which would make the forest disappear. But if they're regulated through wise use, then industry could use that now and for the future. and the forest would still be there for future use in people who enjoy nature or hiking or camping, right? And the entity that's going to do it is going to be the government, the federal government. And it's going to do it managed by experts. And how do we know they're experts? Well, the guy who's going to run the Forestry Service has a PhD in forestry management, right? His task is not to benefit industry in cutting down the forest as quickly as possible, nor preventing it, preserving the forests in their pristine state by not allowing anybody to use it, right? He's going to manage it so that everybody can use it and it will be conserved for the future, right? A perfect embodiment of progressive thinking in this aspect. So how does this tie in to what we're going to see with the Triangle Shirtwaist story and with World War I? With the Triangle Shirtwaist story, what you're going to see is radical action taken by workers dealing with this unrestrained capitalism. How the drive to maximize profits is coming at the expense of the working class. And then you're going to see the tragedy results in a regulatory oversight process, right? So you're going to see those things come together in this Triangle Shirtwaist story. In World War I, you're going to see something related to that. World War I, one of those four progressives, the progressive Democrat by the name of Woodrow Wilson, wins election in 1912. And then the war breaks out in Europe and the United States remains neutral. And Wilson runs on re-election in 1916 as the man who kept us out of war, right? But events would bring the United States into the war. And when the United States enters the war in 1917, the United States is ill prepared for conflict, particularly this conflict that is occurring on a mass industrial scale in the trenches of Europe. This is something that Woodrow Wilson recognizes and recognizes that it needs to be rectified very quickly if the United States is going to play a role in allowing the Allies to succeed. And so he turns to the progressives who are going to scientifically manage this operation of war preparation. But the progressives who are eager to help Woodrow Wilson prepare for this and contribute to this war effort by scientifically managing the effort for maximum efficiency by experts. These progressives also include folks who are desiring other type of progressive reform as well. So Woodrow Wilson can't just say, I want the people who want to reform or manage the war effort. In order to invite the support and help of progressives, which he recognizes he absolutely needs in order to set the nation on a war footing, to draft, train, equip, supply, feed, house, pay, and deliver to the battlefields a massive American expeditionary force. He needs management by these experts, right? But these progressives also, some of them want to reform these various folks to be good Americans as they identify it. And so there are reform components in this progressive era that are part and parcel of this whole bundle of progressive reform that are part of this effort in World War I, as we shall see in the Kennedy book. The strange thing about the progressives is they had captured so much of the way people were thinking about things during the war effort, and then they were so firmly rejected by the American public in that 1920 election. And the progressives who compelled or were part of four different visions in 1912 result in a devastating political defeat for the Democratic Party in 1920 and the disappearance as a political movement of the progressive era. So as we shall see going forward, as I said, these reforms build upon previous reforms. So as we shall see, many of these progressive reforms, which in some cases were built upon populist ideas that were not successful in the populist movement of the late 19th century, are reborn in the New Deal during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression. So these ideas of reform continually resurface, sometimes as successful. There's progressive regulation successes, as we shall see. Some of them not successful, but then reborn during the Great Depression. All right, that's just sort of an overview of progressive ideas for the film and for reading the Kennedy book. All right.